the issue, and I'm not going to create any controversy in your podcast, but when you ask yourself, what do countries like Egypt, Morocco, Rwanda have in common? They're higher performing countries than other countries. I'll leave your audience to answer that question.
I mean, you can actually say it. I don't think it's too controversial, to be honest.
Welcome back. My name is Samuel Gebre, and today we'll continue our conversation with our expert, our energy and infrastructure expert, Mr. Onibokun. As I said earlier, he's an investment professional who has worked in infrastructure over the past decade and a half in investment, not just in Africa, but across Asia and in the US. His CV includes Citi, Arise, and most recently with British International Investment. So he has a very wide scope of knowledge on infrastructure investment. And we will continue our conversation on the same theme, and this time getting a little bit deeper onto some of the investors on the ports across the continent and how global trade and investment into the continent is shifting slightly, as well as we will discuss about rare earths and the transition to green energy and the role that some of the African countries that are resource rich, like DRC and Zambia, can play a role to make a name for themselves. So please enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
When the investment comes in, how does policy play a role in how they deploy the funds? And by that I mean, like, who decides what kind of infrastructure would be invested in? Is it just what makes the most profitable for the investor there? Or is there some push from the local governments to push for investments that they want or they need for the specific country?
Yeah. So having worked in my career both in the private sector, I used to work, like I said, in investment banking, and also more recently I used to work for the British International Investment, and I've also done a lot of work with the DFIs and MDBs. I do understand, and I understand the perspective of how, in terms of what influences investments. I think a lot of it might be a top-down approach, whereby people might sit in Paris and London or in DC and say, this is what we think Africa needs. We think Africa needs clean energy. We think Africa needs, renewable energy. We think Africans in rural areas don't have access to power. We want to increase electrification. That's what we think they need because we have that in the West. So we have power. So they should have that too. Or we want to also empower women in Africa and give them access to funding, SME funding, which are all great things. But I feel that top-down approach of what we think they need is important. But at the same time, you should also go on the ground and ask the Africans themselves, what do you need? What's your priority? What is number one on your needs? And as an African and Nigerian, like I said, what I think Africa needs the most is the ability to economic growth, right? And to achieve that is jobs, job creation. The unemployment rate or the underemployed in Africa is so high, whereby a lot of people are not necessarily well employed, or the economic activity is really, really low. I think, in my view, that's the number one crisis. How do we ensure there's massive economic growth? And how do we do that? How do we achieve that? Is it by building like power plants for electricity? Is it by building more ports? I think which of these investments would have the most impact should be to help with job creation, should be my number one. But then how do we build economic growth in a sustainable way, rather than saying, how do we ensure there's sustainability and help with climate change, and then economic growth becomes number two. So I think, in my view, the DFIs and MDBs have gotten it wrong historically, whereby they're important things, but how they prioritize and how they strategize how it works, I think has also meant that they may not have been as impactful as they would like to be. And I'll give an example. There was a time whereby everybody was really raving within the DFI community around access to like power in rural communities. So let's provide them like this solar home systems whereby they can power and watch TV. They can, get power to read books, which is great for people in the rural areas. But how do you make them sustainable? So you say, fine, we build systems whereby we then charge them pay-as-you-go systems for the solar home systems, and we think it'll work perfectly well. A lot of investments were made in these pay-as-you-go solar home systems in rural areas, which were initially great stories. But the incomes, even though the tariffs that were charged to use these systems are really low, I mean, it wasn't that expensive. But when the average or the daily income is $1 a day for many of these people in the rural community, they have to prioritize. So that $1 a day or $2 a day, I need to put food on the table. There's transportation costs. There's all these things. So they're going to prioritize their necessities, and it's only what they have left as disposable income that they'll use to then pay for this pay-as-you-go solar home systems. So what you then had is that these systems were many people in rural areas borrowed money to, finance their systems, but they couldn't afford to use it, and so they stopped paying. They're like, well, I mean, it's good to have power, but that's not my priority. I'm not going to prioritize putting food on the table over electricity. Whereas I think the paradigm change should have been around when you're investing in power assets. It should be around productive use of assets, PUA. You want to ensure that the assets you're financing for somebody is able to generate revenue. That's just economics 101. If you invest in an asset, it should generate you enough revenue to then cover your costs and other costs. So I think they should have been putting the systems to people that needed power for irrigation. People that small, medium SMEs that perhaps could open a barber shop to charge people to cut their hair, to make their hair, or things of that nature. I think even in the power sector for grid connected nature, we should be thinking about how do we ensure we provide affordable power for industrial use. We don't need to prioritize, in my view, as of today, just connecting people to the power grid just because if you can afford it. If you then have power for industrial use, and these industries then employ people who are getting paid, then these people can then afford the power you give to them, residential power. So we've prioritized residential power over industrial power, which is what is needed the most, right? So I think, in my view, even in the early days of the 60s and 70s, when Kwame Nkrumah was building the hydropower plants, a lot of the use, I think most of the power was gone into the aluminum smelting plants, which was generating revenue for the country, right? That was a key use of that asset. It wasn't just to connect people to the grid. It was to produce, was an industrial use for that hydropower that was built by Kwame Nkrumah in the 60s. I think a lot of those policies should be reviewed, and we should continue where we left off, then ensuring that we are powering infrastructure that would have the most massive contribution to economic growth. And I think that's kind of where the change needs to happen.
When you say it like that, it makes sense. But it's really hard to also, I can see why it would be hard for someone to argue against providing electricity to rural families versus saying, okay, we're going to build an industry that's going to create jobs. It's got several steps before that person gets electricity. And also the quantity of funds that are needed for the industry are probably going to be much higher than for rural electrification with solar panels. The impact aspect of it is more clear. Like you can see it right there and then, and you report in your quarterly reports and say, hey, provided power to 1,000 people. So how do you make that shift change so that you're investing in something that's long term and is sustainable by itself, instead of what happened with the example you gave of the solar panels, where they were not able to pay for the solar later when they wanted to put food on the table?
I think the point you've made there around long term, I think we have to have a long-term plan of where we are and what we want to get to. So yes, it's good to ensure that there's 100% electrification rates of people in rural areas. That's a good goal to have. Question is, when should we target to have that? What comes first? Because resources are scarce. So it's not like you have undisposable income. So if you have $10 and you have to invest, do you start with rural electrification, or do you start with building industries that would help create jobs? Those industries would then generate taxes, which allows the government to have more revenue to then deal with rural electrification. So my view, it has to be a planner, but the first, let's say 5 years, if I have a 10-year view, first 5 years, let me focus on industrialization. After year 5, when industries are solid, profitable. You're paying taxes, there's taxes that are being paid to the government. I can then invest in rural electrification down the road. Or do I invest in rural electrification right now in the first 5 years and then wait? And so it's like, I think in my view, we don't, and this is not necessarily rocket science, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. When I spent some time in Asia. I used to live in Hong Kong and Shanghai a bit, and also Korea for many years. And I spent time understanding like what allowed the country like China to grow rapidly and get over 500 million people out of poverty. So they had that centralized government planning whereby a lot of the growth in China started from the coast, manufacturing hub. So the richest part of China is Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing. The coast is where they had the investments in ports, in power plants, and that's where the manufacturing started. And as those places grew and became more prosperous, they increased the revenue coffers to the government, and then the growth started from east to west. The government didn't just say, we're going to just do random things in some random places. The money had to be there somewhere, right? So I think they started off from a build industrial base. And it's not, I use China as an example, but when you even go back to the UK and you look at how the UK grew, the richest parts of the UK were mainly the places like Newcastle, the steel manufacturing hubs, Liverpool, the ports, London. That's where the growth was, and that's where the jobs were created. And over time, as the country got richer, you can then effectively subsidize the more poorer parts of the country. Same in the US, it's Pittsburgh, it's Baltimore, it's the ports, the coastal cities where they were created manufacturing hubs, steel manufacturing, labor, job creation was prioritized. And over time, you can then afford to subsidize and create rural electrification in the parts like North Dakota where there's nothing. So I think it's not what I'm proposing here is what has happened in other parts of the world. So why is Africa different? Why is Africa now different? Why do we then have to overthink this? In my view, this is what has worked. Copy and paste, and it should work in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be the devil's advocate here for a little bit. I know I'm on the wrong side of this argument, but just for the sake of it, the continent leapfrogged the telephone lines and went to mobile phones. So why can it not leapfrog the energy telephone lines and go to a decentralized system that is easily accessible to the people? I guess it's not the right argument, though.
Yeah, but even to use that example, and I can work with that. Yes, because we leapfrogged in quotes to mobile telephony, it means the people that have access to mobile telephony are actually people in the big cities, right? We talked about the expensive cost of infrastructure. Even though we have mobile access, it's still expensive. Whereas if you're in the West and you have access, it's legacy infrastructure like copper lines, telephone lines, whereby everywhere was already connected, right? And then you added mobile telephony on top of it. It's all redundancy. So even if your mobile networks don't work, you still have that base. In Africa, there's no redundancy. If the mobile telephone stops working for whatever reason, then there's nothing. So I think this leapfrog thing it's cool. It's nice to say, but with no shortcuts in life. We still need to build the right foundation, and that's important. So I think there's a need to also ensure that the infrastructure, the baseline is built, because sometimes you get deceived by leapfrogging, and then what you then see, and if you use the data, there was a time whereby you had the Africa rising story. In the late 2000s, Africa was growing, Nigeria was going at 7-8% GDP rates. Kenya was growing, Ethiopia was growing. There was growth in all those markets. And what was really driving this growth was actually commodity prices were really, really high. And at that time, there was a debt forgiveness that was done by the Paris Club, the IMF, that all African countries, their debt was wiped out. So they had all the revenue was just used for, they had a lot of revenue, the governments, and the economies were growing. But then they also were borrowing more money. So there was a time whereby they now borrowed more money. And in the last 5 years, you've seen what has happened. There's now restructuring of debt in Zambia. In Ghana, there's a default. Ethiopia technically had a default as well. And so what you then see is that economic growth in Africa is very volatile. It grows, it comes down to zero, it grows, it's very volatile. And you won't achieve sustained growth if you have that volatility. Whereas if you have steady growth, right? and the projection is that way, then that's what we need, that line of growth. When you look at Asia, China, even the US, the growth is not volatile like this. It's steady, it's growing, steady growth, consistent growth, which we haven't achieved for a consistent period of time. If Africa has, let's say, 8% steady growth for 20 years or 30 years, the continent will change, but we haven't had that.
Yeah.
And why haven't we had that? Because this leapfrogging thing doesn't work.
Hey, but it sounds cool.
It sounds cool, but it doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, when you say like the key thing that African countries need to do is the jobs part. Like you need to create jobs. I just came from India. I was there for 2 years, and India is growing. India is investing a lot in energy. It's investing a lot in everything, in manufacturing. But its main issue as well is jobs. It's trying to create employment for the 1.4 billion people. But the way it's doing it is the way you're saying. It's creating this industry. And it's using coal, even though for a while it was not an acceptable source of energy. So it's not clear, especially even now in this age of AI, where our consumption of energy is growing, because we saw that coming up in the US elections as well, where energy became a key factor, a key conversation point for a lot of people in the industry, that the US needs to secure its energy as well. And we're seeing China is producing a lot. So yes, I agree with you that energy is obviously the foundation of industrialization, and then that produces jobs, and that jobs creates the in the country. What I want to come to is, and I've seen this both after the Ukraine and Russia conflict, where energy became very important. To the point where there was a story just a couple of weeks ago, where even the definition of ESG is changing in Europe, where funds are now allowed to kind of invest in weapons because it does secure the against Russia, and that is considered to be as sustainable as well. So how these definitions of like we need to have growth, we need to be green, and we're seeing India is saying, you know what, I'm just going to continue investing in coal because I need to create jobs and I need to continue growing. How do all these variables play in the availability of the investment on the continent? What kind of money is there what kind of money should be going into specifically the energy sector on the continent?
Yeah. No, Sam, I think you very well summarized, and I like how you're taking us back to history or what happened during the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Before that, the big push, even for European countries like Germany, the UK, was clean fuel, renewable energy, which is important, don't get me wrong. But when Europe had a crisis and they realized that the cost of couldn't import gas from cheap gas, that the cost of energy was going up and there's going to be a shortage, they then started to incentivize and say, guys, let's start opening up those coal power plants. Let's start drilling oil in the North Sea. I think Germany allowed some coal power plants to keep running. So when it went down and economic growth was important, Europe did what it had to do to ensure economic growth was number one, despite the fact that opening these things would have an impact on climate. But that was not number one. They deprioritized the climate concerns and said we need economic growth because that's what's important to ensure that people have jobs and they can have food on the table.
Yes.
Unfortunately for Africa, that's not been what has been applied. Whereas European states are saying, even though we know you don't have jobs, whereby the conversation should be around, given what you have, where can you get the cheapest source of energy, whether it's gas, even coal. There's ways to make coal clean, geothermal, hydro, whatever it is. Given what you have, where source the cheapest of energy at scale? So if you can have cheap energy, you also make your manufacturing competitive. Because Africa, again, like I said, is competing with the world. If the cost of power in Asia or in Vietnam is 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour, and in Africa it costs 10 cents, then why should a manufacturer come to Africa? It's going to stay in Asia, even though, yes, everything is good, there's impact, but it all comes back to the numbers. So how do we ensure that we get cheap, affordable power in Africa to make us competitive to support manufacturing? So you talked about India. India, of course, besides technology, which we know they're very great at, they don't only India exports a lot of processed agricultural products too, whether it's cashew, for example, a lot of the cashew nuts or the pistachios that are produced locally in Africa in raw form are exported to India for processing before then packaged to Europe. So they do a lot of the processing because one, they have power, and they also have skilled labor. So I think the other piece we have to hear on how do we upscale our people, not just sending them to universities, but also introducing things like introducing technical education to make them a lot more skilled. So Africa is a skilled continent. You know, a lot of our artifacts were stolen from us and in many African museums. So we have the ability to be very skilled and use our hands to create great products. We need to continue our tradition and that history. I think a lot of education is required and uplifting around skill sets, cheap access to power to ensure that we can, when our manufacturing is competitive, and we need to figure out what works for us. Now, the problem is that we say EU dictates the tune, dictates the piper. I think I hope I got that right. A lot of the funding, like I said, is coming from the West or from Asia or from the US, and they can decide how they want to spend their money, which is valid. If that's money, but I think Africans need to also be ensured that we find ways to innovative ways whereby when trading or selling agreements, those agreements make sense for us as well. And I like what Ethiopia has done as well by building this hydropower project in I think it's called the Great. Can you remember the full name of the in Ethiopia? The what?
It's called the GERD.
Yes, I think for me that allows Ethiopia to be sustainable, cheap access to hydro. Although it's of course controversial, I'm hoping these three countries involved can find an amicable way to find peace, because this is a great source of power that can power the continent. So we need more projects like this that utilize our natural resources to accelerate manufacturing and growth and job creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that actually goes back to what we said at the beginning, where you try to mobilize local funding, because for, I think, political reasons, Ethiopia was not able to get funding for the Renaissance Dam, and it's used, sold local bonds over the years, which the whole thing cost about $5 billion. It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But it was able to do it sort of by itself, which is pretty impressive. I don't know if this is something that other African countries will see and say, okay, maybe this is something we can replicate to build projects in their countries. One other thing I tried to even cover a few months ago in an attempt to de-risk some of the currency issues. The political issues, I don't know how to de-risk them really. Currency issues, I'm seeing some new instruments that are coming up with using local currency debt, local currency but external debt, so that you're not getting really hammered with the currency versus value. What ways are there for investors, both local and international, to invest in the continent, or even for governments to replicate what Ethiopia has done, so that they can de-risk at least part of the big Africa, even though, as you said earlier, it's one of the lowest in default?
Yeah, so definitely, given the currency issues, there's a need for us to start thinking about local currency funding for a lot of our projects. The issue, though, is that local currency funding is expensive. There's a reason why people potentially take USD funding or hard currency funding, because initially it's cheaper. I think where you get hurt is when the currency devaluation, hence you need more Kenyan shillings or more naira to convert to dollars to pay your lenders back. And the reason why we have to tackle, like, why is the current cost of funding on the continent expensive? And I think the issue is around liquidity. There's not enough liquidity in the market for local currency. And the governments themselves need to find ways of generating more revenue by taxing more people, increasing the tax base. So there are some solutions that I think we need to think as policymakers. What do we need to bring at the cost of that? But in the short to medium term, one of the things that I think I'd like to maybe bring as a potential solution is how do we, going back to the area of collaboration, perhaps rely more on diaspora funding for projects. I think a lot of the biggest revenue contribution to GDP or revenue in countries is actually diaspora funding. Whether it's Ethiopia or Nigeria, I think diaspora funding remittances make up the most, the source of revenue for many people on the continent. Everybody has a mom or dad or auntie or uncle that sends money back home to them. That's the biggest source of funding for many countries on the continent. Now, a lot of the funding has been going to funding consumer, for consumption. So somebody has a wedding or a party or a funeral to fund or this and that, which is all needed. But if we can also use that funding to say, how do we also come together and fund infrastructure? A country surprisingly that did that successfully was Somalia. There's a part of Mogadishu, I can't remember the actual name, I'll have to look it up, whereby they realized that there was no infrastructure and it was expensive and it was almost hard to get goods in and out of the country. So the community and through diaspora raised, I think, I want to say $200 million or more in crowdfunding through diaspora funding, and it was very well structured to build out a port. They didn't rely on any foreign lending. It was Somalians who sent money back home, partnering with locals to fund and build those ports. And this port now currently is owned by the community, and then it's locally owned. I think for me that's a very successful story that should be replicated in other parts, whereby potentially the use of diaspora bonds. So the governments could, for instance, if we're going to raise a diaspora bond to fund a bridge that connects this to this, or to fund a power plant, and that bond will provide a yield of 8-10%, right? So I think people in diaspora, when you go home and your fund is being used to actually build an amazing railway or bridge, you're happy. You want to see more funding. Also, you also could make from it or some decent yield. I think that's one way whereby we can tap into diaspora funding and be more structured about it, because that could be a big source of funding. Because I think our biggest exports is actually our people. I think you talk about India, biggest exports is human resources, things that have gone to the US, to Europe, who work in tech firms, and these people are also sending money back home. That also helps support the economy there. And same as China. So I think, how do we then leverage that? I think contribution I'll make to your question around diaspora funding for infrastructure projects.
Yeah. I'm very surprised about port in Somalia, that a group just decided that they can collaborate together and build a port in about $200 million. But it's not something I know there's a lot of cooperative spirit in Africa. Then Australia, it's like towards weddings, or for funerals, or for graduation. It's for life, and it's not for investment that they expect the government or someone else to do. Right? It's a mental shift that needs to happen. That you can also do this. You can build a bridge.
Yeah, I think your point, can't expect the government's not going to. If we're going to wait for the governments to do everything, we'll be having this conversation in 1,000 years from now. I think there has to be a shift that it's not the government. We are the government. The government are the people. So we need to take responsibility and figure out how do we then support and play a part.
And I'm going to go back to the Ethiopian case, because it's being officially launched this week, and I think it's kind of an impressive story, because it's not every day you hear an African government deciding, okay, we're going to build a multi-billion-dollar mega project without external financing. And you're gonna have hiccups here and there. There's gonna be issues, and the GERD has also had a lot of issues. But it took visionary leaders at the beginning and now at the end to bring it to a conclusion, and it will potentially be able to pay off its cost within 5 years. That is, I know you work in finance, but when you have a mega project like that is able to pay for itself within 5-6 years, that's a really good return. And as someone who's here and seeing it, I'm pretty impressed. But I'll get to Nigeria as well, and kind of figure out what the energy space is like. It seems like not only individuals in their homes, but also industry has its own. It creates its own energy. Like, it's not the central energy supply isn't there. So how does that play with Nigeria's intent for development, for growth, when you have such fragmented energy sources?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head, fragmented, which is somewhat inefficient. And I think for us to have skill and economies of scale and low costs, there have to be a way to collaborate because many of the systems may also be underutilized. So you might be a local manufacturer, you 10 megawatt power plants and you're operating a day, but you're only using, let's say, like 50% capacity because at night it's doing nothing. So it's a waste. Whereas if it was grid connected at night, people in the grid have access to it as well. So I think, you know, maybe the solution may be okay, maybe to actually have decentralized power, but then how do you then ensure that this power is actually grid connected and there's also some sort of feed-in tariff whereby you can earn money, you can earn revenue by selling to the grid. So everybody then has their own power. Everybody's a power producer selling to the grid, and that's okay. I mean, that's pretty much what decentralized currency around Bitcoin is. Everybody has control over what it is, so it's not a problem. The thing is, like, how do you ensure there's that interconnection? And that's what's missing. And then to do that, you also have to invest heavily in transmission. So we spoke a lot about generation, but also there's a little big problem in transmission grids, which are very old, and there's a lot of investment that are needed. And they're still most of them are owned by governments who are underfunded and unable to make the right investment for transmissions to support this new energy transition of smart grid, smart metering, renewable energy, whereby the energy is not, the frequencies are different. So there's a need for smarter grids. So that's a big area of investment that are needed. And except those pieces are done, it would be hard to really take advantage of the distributed energy sources that we currently have in different homes in Nigeria and other parts of the continent.
Yeah. Do you see that missing gap being met anytime in the near future? Is there a policy towards moving that? I know like Nigeria went through like a whole privatization process for the energy production, which was supposed to have, moved things forward. But I don't know, so far it doesn't seem to have done that. There's a lot of investment that's still needed.
Yeah. So you've seen a move into what you call independent transmission producers. So, similar to IPPs for power for generators, transmission lines. So you're seeing some IPT, independent power transmission lines that have been proposed to concessional transmission lines. I think you've seen a lot of that in countries like potential in Zambia, Mozambique, and more countries. So my old firm I work for, BII, owns a platform called GridWorks, and they help finance and build, privatized transmission lines across many African countries. I think they have a few projects right now in Uganda and other markets. Then where you're seeing a lot of potential actually is around areas of critical minerals and mining, whereby you have a lot of these like big mining companies that operate in the copper belt, whether Zambia or Angola or in DRC, and they need power, right? And they want to, most of them want to renewable or cleaner energy sources of power. So I think one of the things they want to do is how do you then build large scale projects that are within this power plant, but then sell the excess power to the grid. And to do that, you need transmission lines to be functional. Also, they may not want to necessarily build power plants in the mining firm because the sources of renewable energy, if that's where you want to go, may not be where your manufacturing plant is located. So it may be somewhere on the coast. But how do you then will or evacuate that power from that place through the transmission line to your copper mining facility? So I think there's a need to then potentially we'll start off by having maybe transmission lines that connect some of these mines to the sources of power. And I think I like that model because it's self-sustaining because those are generating hard currency. They can afford to fund and build out the transmission lines and you get paid for it. And hopefully, if our governments plan better, the taxpayers taxing these commodities could then be used to create a buffer to then finance the larger scale infrastructure in other parts of the country. So you effectively have the structure whereby you have the mines effectively subsidizing the other part of the country, but it's not a government subsidy directly. It's coming from a private sector manufacturer of commodities, and everybody wins there. I think how do we ensure that our natural resources are used wisely and efficiently to fund infrastructure and development. And that's one model. Maybe you create some sort of like, infrastructure fund, or something more fund that takes the revenues from exports of the mine and then use it to focus on infrastructure development. So that's another model to do that as well. But to your question, transmission lines are key, and they are that are having building models of independent power transmission lines. And I talked about Zambia, Mozambique, Uganda as well. And there's also platforms like Greenworks owned by BRI that are looking to invest in this space.
Okay. Yeah, those seem to be connected to minerals. So it's a feeder for the mineral plants, which makes economic sense, and overall able to use those funds as a government to expand the
Access.
and access. Yeah, I know most of the conversation we've had now is in more or less sub-Saharan Africa. The other big economy on the continent, South Africa, has also had energy issues in the past. But I want to, because I've heard Morocco, on the other hand, seems to be, or just North Africa in general, seems to be doing a much better job with not just energy production, because I think they have, North Africa, one of the largest solar plants in the desert. They're putting transmission lines to Europe. I don't know, tell me, what lessons can we learn from a country like Morocco?
So Morocco, and I also include Egypt to that mix as well. They've done a great job of increasing generation. I think Egypt's a couple of years ago, energy crisis, and a lot of investments were made into building renewable energy power plants, and they were able to attract energy developers like Aqua, Scartech to invest in their renewable energy space. So I think there's been a few large-scale projects that have been built in gigawatts of renewable that have been built to increase Egypt's renewable energy mix from a very low base to, I think there's a goal by 2030 or 2050 to get to, I think, you don't quote me on a number, maybe 30% or so of the mix. Same as Morocco as well, investments in renewable energy, but also just in power. I think, in my view, what's common to these two countries is stable, consistent policy. The government sets out the policy that this is what we want to do. This is a blueprint for the next 10 years. And in those two countries, at least in the last 10 years or more, there's been stable governments. I know Egypt had its crisis before that, but in general, there's been the same government in power that's able to ensure that those policies are effected, are implemented over time. That also gives the private sector confidence to know that things will, there's stability in policies, and that attracts foreign investments. So I think, in my view, that's been a drive for growth around stability in both policies and in governance. And I know you didn't ask me this question, but I think the biggest issue Africa has is a governance. If we can fix that governance issue, everything gets solved. If there's governance, if there's stability, policies are very clear. It's easier said than done, but that's the issue. And I'm not going to create any controversy in your podcast, but when you ask yourself, what do countries like Egypt, Morocco, Rwanda have in common? They're higher performing countries than other countries. I'll leave your audience to answer that question.
I mean, you can actually say it. I don't think it's too controversial, to be honest. I want us to take a step for a moment here, because I've seen investments, especially on energy, on ports coming from the UAE, because previously it was the Chinese that used to invest a lot of infrastructure around the continent with the Belt and Road, but now across the continent, or at least along the coasts of the continent, a lot of investment from the UAE. I don't know, try and explain to me why the UAE is investing a lot in ports on the continent. What's their big picture strategy? What kind of relations should we have vis-a-vis what the relationship has been with China and the continent?
So to answer the question, I think there's the statistics there, and again, in terms of where that is sourced from. That in 2019 and 2023, the UAE firms have committed over $110 billion into Africa, right? And from ports to others, to critical minerals, and other strategic infrastructure or sectors. And what's driving this growth is, there's a few reasons. One, go back to history. Even it's not new. So you look at Oman. Oman used to actually be the economic, I guess, giant of that region. The, I guess I don't know. It was an imperialist. They had the monarchy there, and it was very influential. And the trading span of Oman cut across the Middle East, all the way to the Horn of Africa, all the way to Zanzibar, Kenya. There's a reason when you go to Zanzibar, you go to Lamu, you see the influence of Gulf and Omani culture in this place, because these are trading routes that date back. People in the Middle East, Arabs, have always traded with Africa. It's not a new thing. There's always been trade before the European colonialists came. Europeans came to Africa. Africans traded a lot with people from the Middle East. And that's also influenced by our language. Swahili is a mix of Arabic and local African dialects. I'm Yoruba, and many Yoruba words have a lot of Arabic names. So for those who are Nigerians in the podcast, the ones in Yoruba is Alubosa, and it's come from Albasa, which is also an Arabic name. Yeah, so it's not a new phenomenon. So no one should be surprised that there's trade coming from the Gulf to Africa. It's always been there. Perhaps at some point it declined because the Europeans filled that gap, but now it's changing again. And now you have, the UAE, Saudis investing on the continent and trying to do trade. And secondly, it also makes sense around proximity. The Gulf is close to Africa. It's just on the horn over there. Effectively, I'm not sure what continent is the Middle East part of. Is it Asia? Is it Africa? It's all connected, right? So they are an extension, in my view, of Africa in ways. So I think we shouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of interest in trade. But three, the macros make sense as well around. It's also a population of 1.2 billion people, right? And if you're a Gulf country, you want to expand your influence. Where do you start from? You start from places that are a bit closer to you, to impose your influence. So, for lack of a better word. So I think it's welcome for Africa, because it makes that we have more trade of partners to work with. Like I said, historically we used to trade with them. The Europeans came, the Americans, the Chinese. Now we have another option, and also India is also another growing power too for trade. So we have more options. I think it's a good thing. How we use it is different. So we have to be very smart about how we trade with anybody to ensure that the trade is fair, and we're getting the tools or the end of the again. I want to go back to the slave trade. During the slave trade between 1500s and 1800s, the Europeans was trade. They'll come and trade African slaves and to the Americas. In exchange, they gave us rum, clothing materials, and that was the exchange. So my question for you was that the exchange? If the guy on the other side was a bit smarter, it's wrong for slavery anyways, but at least if you're going to trade, it should be a fair trade. And it has continued around what are we getting in return for the trade. We should be getting things that will be beneficial to our people, that will help uplift the people in terms of manufacturing, job creation, technical expertise. That's the thing we should be getting from the trade, and not just consumer goods, or not just trade that leaves us not underdeveloped. So I think that's kind of what we should be. I don't blame the other part of the table. It's the train that should be smarter, and you need to be smarter and wise and how you trade them, and that's where the work needs to go.
But so I guess to follow up on that question, and I can also take it back to I'll make it two with the Chinese, with the UAE, and I guess India and all the Western investors. Is the investment that's coming onto the continent now on equal terms or beneficial for the African governments, or is it trading slaves for them still? What do you think?
I would like to bucket it, because every African countries is also African countries. I think some countries that do a better job than others. So maybe countries like Rwanda, I think, has been able to extract a fair bargain. And you go to Rwanda, you see the growth that is going on, both in its tourism, in areas of like transportation. I know, for example, Rwanda has created also of course, Ethiopian Airlines is a world-class airline in Africa, but we're trying to create a Rwanda Air. and they're looking to build a new airport called Bugesera Airport, and are partnering, I believe, with Qatar to build out this new airport. So I think to make Rwanda also a hub, So that's an example of, in my mind, potentially good trade, right? Because you also help with transportation. It's also skill empowerment because you potentially train a pilot to become a hub, just like what Ethiopia has done. And Ethiopian Airways is generating a lot of revenue for the government. And so some countries do a better job than others. That's what I would say. South Africa, I think, has historically also done a great job because of its push for independence and ensuring that there's like this manufacturing there's a lot of auto manufacturing there, processing in the country for what you get and trying to manage that. Some others are not doing a fair job, and it's purely just extractive, and you're getting almost going back to the time of 1800s rum and coke for giving up your gold and the diamonds and your copper and whatever else you have as the resources. So I think there's more work to be done to ensure that there's a fair trade in some of these other countries.
Okay. I don't know, going back to energy, but I want to touch energy with rare earth minerals. But I want us to go like from the basics of it. What are rare earth minerals and why are they important for energy?
So these minerals are important to help support our energy transition from fossil based to cleaner energy. If you are a user of smartphones, you also want to have solar panels. A lot of the future sources of energy require a lot on commodities like rare earths, lithium for battery manufacturing, even iron ore as well. And these are critical for energy transition. So that's why they're very important. And a lot of these resources are actually found in Africa, whether it's a lot of cobalt and lithium and copper is found across the copper belt from DRC to Zambia and that region, and even across various corridors in Africa. South Africa historically had a lot of minerals in platinum, manganese, all also very key for the energy transition. So that's why they are very, very important. And Africa plays a key role in our supply chain. And because of the importance of what they are, you're now seeing almost like a fight for ensuring energy security or critical mineral security by various Western countries. You have the US pushing for more independence from China, because China actually as of today has kind of won that war or the race around controlling critical mineral sector. A lot of the processing of lithium or iron ore is done in China, right? So China is a leader in processing and also has a lot of rare earths as well. And the US doesn't want to be too dependent, or the West doesn't want to be dependent on China for that because they see that as a security concern. And hence they're looking to secure their own access to these resources, be it in Africa or wherever in the world it is, or Ukraine or wherever it is. So I think now you're seeing a race. Now, how can Africa play smart? I think in my view, immediately to be able to just, as young Africans, just start processing right away. I think to process this, you need to have the right infrastructure in place, whether it's energy resources need to be in place, the right policies to transport. You also need to have the right skilled labor, and all these things have to be in place. But if I was an African government, I would have almost like a 10-year plan and say, you know what? For the first 4 or 5 years, we're going to allow the resources to be exported and processed, but then we'll make it clear in our investment code that after this year 5, we expect that some processing is done, and all this processing, all the mining companies need to start creating a pot of capital that will enable that transition to happen. And in parallel as well, I also ensure that there are, co-enabling infrastructure sectors that are set up, right, to support processing, right? So you can't just be a standalone. There may need to be some sort of more manufacturing and industrialization required. So I think to be a medium term policy. It won't be like right away we should start processing. I think it's gradual, but I think there should be a plan in place. And with time, you start enforcing those plans. And that's what most markets have done, whether it's China, India in the past. You start off by allowing everybody to come into your country, but you have controls in place. And at the right time, then ensure that you start taking control of those resources and ensure that it benefits the people the most?
I think just in passing, like, I keep hearing about how Africa is very mineral rich, especially DRC is very mineral rich, and also on these critical rare earths as well. But how true is because we've also seen in the news that US made a deal with Ukraine, rare earths. I know China, not only do they control the value chain, but they also have rare earths there. So does DRC really have a good proportion of this rare earths for it to be able to have some influence over time?
Yes, the DRC has, of course, a lot of the resources required for the transition. So does its neighboring countries. So does South Africa. So does Ghana. So does Nigeria. And I think if your question is, does DRC have the strength, the leverage to determine the terms and influence the direction of it? Perhaps alone, no. But if all 54 countries in Africa come together as a bloc, then they stand a better chance than going on your own. I think going back to your question around the Africa Free Trade Agreement and coming together, I think it is more collaboration whereby we say that, for example, because the resources are spread across the continent. So you might say the regions with the cheapest energy, especially renewables, might be places like Namibia, which has a lot of solar, or North Africa, whereby you have a lot of access to solar resources. And then places along the coast of South Africa, Mozambique have access to wind energy. Those become the big power hubs, and you can build massive power plants that then connect to DRC, and you use a South African power pool to get the energy from those resources there. They are then the DRC or Zambia produces the copper, but maybe because the ports are closer to Port Elizabeth or closer to Walvis Bay, you build an battery power plants, a battery manufacturing on the coast, right, in that region. So everybody specializes in certain things. We are all not doing the same exact thing. We have specializations that we build and collaborate over time to ensure that Africa becomes prosperous. And that's what the EU, the Europe did well. So everybody has what they do. The countries are known for car manufacturing. Some are known for pharmaceuticals. Some are known for energy, for different things. And you allow those countries to specialize. And as a bloc, you can then influence. And I think that's kind of where we need to get to, around just thinking, coming together and forming these blocks of partnerships to compete globally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ope. As you said, that was my last question. Now, thank you very much for being very generous with your time and your knowledge. I did enjoy having this conversation and also catching up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam.